Welcome to this lecture in the Advanced HTML and CSS course. This lecture is on the topic WAI, ARIA. So we'll know what is WAI, UI, ARIA. Introduction. In the previous lessons, you learned several ways to make websites more accessible. Those lessons, however, were just the tip of the accessible iceberg. WAI ARIA introduces attributes that can help make websites even more accessible by modifying the semantics and context of elements, which can give you greater control over how those elements are perceived by assistive technologies. Because this subject can get so complicated, we are only going to cover two attributes that you can get a lot of use from. Learning outcomes. Know the purpose of WAI ARIA. Know what ARIA can't do. Understand the 5 rules of ARIA use. Understand what the accessibility tree is. Understand the 3 ARIA attributes that can add labels to elements. Understand what the ARIA hidden attribute does. What is WAI ARIA? WAI ARIA stands for Deep Breadth the Web Accessibility Initiatives, Accessible Rich Internet Applications Specification. The purpose of WAI ARIA, often referred to as just ARIA, is to define a way to make web content more accessible when native HTML is unable to do so. Think of ARIA as something that fills in the accessible gaps left by native HTML. It's important to note that ARIA can only modify the semantics or context of an element. ARIA can't. Modify an element's appearance, modify an element's behavior, add focusability, or add keyboard event handling. When you use ARIA, you will usually have to take additional steps to add in any missing semantics or functionality. Remember the keyboard navigation lesson and how we had to add in functionality to the div buttons? The 5 rules of ARIA. ARIA can be extremely powerful when used correctly, but it can be equally as dangerous when used incorrectly. Because of this, you should keep in mind that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA, even when you have the best intentions. The WCAG has something called the 5 rules of ARIA, which, as you may have guessed, are rules you should follow when using ARIA. Although we don't cover all of the terms mentioned below, it's still important to understand the rules themselves, especially if you decide to dive deeper into ARIA on your own. 1. Always use native HTML elements and attributes over ARIA when possible. 2. Never change native semantics unless you have no other choice. 3. All interactive ARIA controls must be usable with a keyboard. 4. Never use role presentation or ARIA hidden true on focusable elements. 5. All interactive elements must have an accessible name. The accessibility tree. Before we get into a couple of the ARIA attributes available to us, it's important to know some basics of what the accessibility tree is, as it will help you understand just what those attributes are actually doing. The accessibility tree is based on the DOM, something you should be very familiar with by now. While the DOM represents nodes and objects that make up a web page, the accessibility tree contains only the accessibility related information that will be used by assistive technologies. The way ARIA works is by modifying properties of the objects that make up this accessibility tree. For this lesson, we are only going to focus on 2 of these properties. So which 2 are properties? Name, also known as the accessible name, which is what assistive technologies announce to a user, and what separates elements of the same type from one another. The name may be set to 1 or more native labels, including the text contents of an element, the label element, or the alt attribute, to name a few. Description. This is what assistive technologies announce in addition to its accessible name. ARIA labels. ARIA labels help users of assistive technologies better understand the content of a web page by overriding native labels or providing additional descriptive text. Unlike the label element, ARIA labels aren't limited to being used on only a select few elements, though they still have their own limitations. You may remember being warned against using the ID attribute earlier in the curriculum. To briefly recap, normally you want to avoid overusing the ID attributes or even using it when it isn't necessary, which more often than not it isn't, and you should stick with using classes. There are several ARIA attributes, however, that actually require another element to have an ID. When using such ARIA attributes, you would provide an ID to one element, and you would then pass it that ID value as another element's ARIA attribute value. This creates a link between the elements, similar to how a label element's for attribute creates a link to an input's ID. Of the three types of ARIA labels mentioned below, both ARIA labeled by and ARIA described by are two of the ARIA attributes that require another element to be given an ID. ARIA label. ARIA label attribute overrides any native label of an element and modifies its name property in the accessibility tree. It is best used when an element doesn't already have a native label. When added, the string value of the ARIA label attribute becomes the element's accessible name. However, ARIA label does not have any effect on some HTML element such as div and span. So this is a link to the github.com issue. So you can read more about that in there. A common use for ARIA label can be found in the close buttons of menus or modals. Button type button, ARIA label is close menu, and then you have the cross. So the cross means nothing, but the ARIA label announces itself as close menu. Instead of a screen reader announcing X button, which makes little sense to the user, it would announce close menu button. Another way you could use ARIA label is on landmark elements. Our 78 HTML lesson gets another shout out again. So nav ARIA label main navigation, and then you include your navigation. Once a screen reader reaches the above HTML, it would announce main navigation, navigation landmark. If you have multiple navigation elements on a page, you could give each a different ARIA label value in order to separate them from one another, making them more understandable for screen reader user. Pretty neat, huh? So one can be a main navigation, one can be a sidebar navigation, there can be a footer navigation. So these are examples of different navigations. Do not use ARIA label to change how a word is phonetically announced. Certain words may not get announced correctly by a screen reader, and you may have a temptation to try and fix this. You may end up fixing how a word is announced by a screen reader, but that fix could end up making no sense when announced by other assistive technologies like a braille reader. So you should avoid doing this. ARIA labeled by. The ARIA labeled by attribute provides both the native label and the ARIA label attribute. ARIA labeled by changes an element's accessible name created by ARIA labeled by to a concatenated string of the text contents or alt attributes of the labeling element, the ones whose ID are passed in. The great thing about ARIA labeled by is that not only can you pass in any number of ID references, but you can also have an element reference itself. Keep in mind that you can't pass in the same reference multiple times because any subsequent references after the first will be ignored. So here is an example. Here's the labeling element H2 ID label for shirts, and here's the labeled element. Note the order of the ID references passed in. So button type button, ID is shop button, and then ARIA labeled by label, then shop button and shop now button. The HTML above would be announced by a screen reader as shirts. So first it will highlight shirts, shop now button. So the label will come from shop now, and then the button. This can make multiple shop now buttons on a page unique from one another and thus provide the additional context, making the page more understandable. Another great thing about ARIA labeled by is that even if a labeling element is visually hidden, either by the hidden HTML attribute or with CSS like visibility or display none, it will still modify the accessible name of the labeled element. This can be useful if you want to label an element for users of assistive technologies, but you don't want that element's label or labels to be visible to sighted users. So this is one neat trick to make the label invisible, label hidden on the web page. Although it may work somewhat similarly to the native label element, ARIA labeled by does not have the same event handling by default. This is functionality you would have to add in yourself via JavaScript if you need so. Clicking the label element gives focus to the input element. So the label for name, and then input ID. So this ID has to be same as the for. That's how they're linked. The label is linked to the input. Type text. Clicking the div element won't give focus to the input element. So because this is ID label and labeled by label, but this would not have the same thing that like if we click the label, it will highlight the input ID. ARIA described by. The ARIA described by attribute modifies the description property in the accessibility tree. Similar to the ARIA labeled by attribute, when you use this attribute, you pass in the ID values of other elements as the ARIA described by value. And the elements whose ID value are passed in can also be visually hidden. So example, label, password. So inside label, they will put type password. Area described by password requirements. So this password requirements, where is it coming from? So it's coming from this ID, password requirements, so which has a span. Password must be at least 10 characters long. When the input element receives focus, a screen reader would announce password. So it will be password, edit protected. Password must be at least 10 characters long. This immediately notifies the screen reader user of any requirements for the password they want to choose anytime the input receives focus. Hiding content from the accessibility tree. Similar to how you can visually hide elements with the hidden HTML attribute or the display and visibility CSS properties, you can use the ARIA hidden attribute to hide certain elements such as decorative images and icons from the accessibility tree. The difference with ARIA hidden, however, is that the element will remain visible to sighted users. This can be especially useful when you want to add an icon inside of another element. For example, if you were to use material icons inside of a button, so here we have the button, then we have this icon, then we have the text add book. Whereas in example 2 button, so we have material icons, ARIA hidden true, then we have that add icon, and then text add book. While both of the above example would look visually identical, the button in example 1 would be announced as a screen reader as add book. So add, and then add book button, because it's of type button. The text content of the span and the text content of the button itself are concatenated as the accessible name of the button. The button in example 2, however, hides the span from the accessibility tree, so its text content isn't added to the button's accessible name, meaning a screen reader would correctly announce add book and then button. So that's why good use of using ARIA hidden as true. Be careful when using this attribute though. When you give an element ARIA hidden equal to true, all children of that element will also become hidden to the accessibility tree. So it percolates to all the children and grandchildren. Adding ARIA hidden false to a child element won't have any effect if one of its parents still has ARIA hidden true either. So this is important to keep in mind. You should also be careful not to give an element ARIA hidden true if it is focusable. Doing so would cause nothing to be announced when the element receives focus, which would confuse users that use a screen reader and navigate the page via a keyboard. So knowledge check. What purpose does ARIA serve? So we'll have addressed that up in the article. What are the 4 things ARIA can't do? So this is also addressed. What are the 5 rules of ARIA? We have addressed the 5 rules. What is the accessibility tree? Similar to the DOM tree that we have that we focus on. What are the differences between the 3 ARIA labels? And what does the ARIA hidden attribute do? So ARIA name, ARIA labeled by, ARIA hidden. Additional resources. In additional resources, we have an in-depth guide to ARIA roles. So this is a11yproject.com. It's an article on there. This article goes over an ARIA attribute that alters the semantics of elements, which can allow you to create custom inputs, buttons, and more. Just keep in mind rule number 1 of the ARIA rules. ARIA live region. So this is again MD and Mozilla article. ARIA live regions are another type of ARIA attribute that are incredibly useful for having dynamic updates made to a page announced by Assistive Technologies. A word of warning: if you decide to dive into this topic, the assertive live region may not work in the JAWS and NVDA screen readers, but the role alert attribute, which has an implicit live region of assertive, should. So these are different elements how they respond to ARIA. ARIA accessibility APIs and coding like you give a damn. So this is a YouTube 30-minute YouTube video that covers some concepts introduced in the previous lesson. The importance of ARIA attributes and an example of how to add functionality to a custom ARIA button. Accessibility fundamentals with Rob Dodson. This is also another 30-minute YouTube video that covers some things mentioned in the previous lessons, but it also covers the accessibility tree, ARIA, and if you still need to be convinced why using semantic HTML is important. So we have covered semantic HTML in a previous lecture. So that goes hand in hand with ARIA's requirements. With that, we'll come to the end of this lesson. So let's move on to the next one.